how, like, we see Jesus living out this, um, his ministry and how he embodies this reality is that one, we just taking the time to eat and dine and drink with people all the time. The gospel seen the chosen. But one of the things that I do really appreciate about the chosen, Sarah and I have watched some of it, we haven't been through all of it, is the way that it brings that everyday life to reality. So the chosen is a show that features Jesus and the disciples and just walks kind of through his life and ministry, but it brings many of the everyday back and forth of his ministry to life. And so there's a scene of it ends just with them um, just enjoying this wonderful, like the of that. Thank you that Jesus spent that time with his friends, laughing and enjoying. And we can kind of sometimes I think that I forget that, right? That there was just that daily interaction that he had. And we see it when it references the, the meals he goes to and partakes in. And you see it even in the way when it says the Son of Man in Matthew 11:19 says, the Son of Man came eating and drinking to say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved rightly by her deeds. And again, people would look at him and were shaking their fingers because he was taking time to be with people, enjoying their presence and their fellowship. And of course, ministering to them in very real and deep ways. But I think we see Jesus just appreciating the goodness of the world, the goodness of the simple things, food and fellowship and times together. As Paul reminds us, in all things, right? Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I rejoice, and that includes the everyday gifts that God has provided to us. For me, it's easy oftentimes to get caught up in the what's next. When I think about how do I apply? How should I be applying this in my life? How is this thing going to work out? Whether that was in grad school or during my dissertation, it's easy to get caught up in those bigger questions, figure out how God's going to figure out the next thing. And I think when I get into that or get stressed about those kinds of things, I can forget just what God has placed right before me. And I found that when I can kind of let go of some of the bigger questions and enjoy just what's been given, enjoy those things, whether it's just sitting out back on a cool evening, or maybe that God has given. And I find that, when I do that, there's a tangible reality that I'm more at peace when I take the time to enjoy the simple things of the day. I think Proverbs encourages us to lean into where might God be teaching us, wanting us to learn or to grow. Ecclesiastes, when it comes to kind of wisdom for walking, I think it's calling us, where might God be asking you to lay down a bigger question? Now, and where is God calling you to experience His joy in the everyday moments of your life? And there are moments where you just need to just stop and be joyful, just to appreciate the small things that are happening. Appreciate and enjoy what God has given. So Proverbs, we can and lean into the everyday moments and the joy of the books. But in Job, I think Job is wisdom that reminds us that even in the midst of pain and sorrow and wrestling with God, that God meets us in those times. To continue to trust God, who is good, but who also is mysterious too. It's hard to trust at times. God is, look at Job's self-defense, for example, of himself. He highlights how he in just the way he lived his life. He was guided by godly wisdom, and he experienced the flourishing of life. Job starts highlighting how Job flourished in who he was. But however, of course, in a short span of time, we know that he loses. And he's, just suffering on all sides, refers to Job. And in the dialogue then that the book is mostly composed of, this dialogue with his friends, Job maintains that he is upright and he maintains his innocence. But his friends conclude, they look at the world and they conclude, well, Job, you must have done something wrong, right? Like, for this amount of suffering, you must have committed a pretty egregious sin of some sort. So repent, and let's see if God will get your life back on track. They equate suffering with sinning, essentially, with having gone against God in some way. His friends do. And Job says, that's not the case. I have lived in a way that honors God, and he maintains that posture. So the friends are calling him to repent of his folly, and Job is saying, God, answer me. Come litigate my case. And in the end, we know that God does show up. He comes to Job and he meets him. He doesn't really give him an answer, but he shows up and meets him. And in meeting him and taking him kind of on a tour of the wonder and mystery of God's creation, he does help Job to see that Job's own perspective is limited, but he is called to trust really in the wonder and the mystery and the person of who God is. And that it is God's presence that I think so much provides the answer. Throughout this tour, as you get towards the end of the book, where you find out that Job recognized his own smallness in the face and the wonder of God, and he says, in 44, this is from the scholar, he says, Job's brief response is the first phase of his reaction to the speeches of Yahweh. Job's initial emphatic word is, I am small. He does not confess, I have sinned, as his friends may have wished. He does not cry, I am terrified, as he thought might happen. He does not admit, I am wrong, as Elihu would have preferred, another one of a fourth kind of dialogue partner there in the book. But he says, I'm small. So he recognizes the grandness of God and his own limited perspective and all that's taking place. And in 42:5, Job says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And so in this, I think, through Job's wrestling, he desires for God's answer. And what God does is God kind of shows up. He becomes present. He arrives and he engages with Job. Doesn't necessarily give him maybe the answer he thought he was going to get, but he gets God. He gets the presence of God there. As the scholar I was quoting before, Norman Havel, says, Yahweh's appearance honors Job. His speech challenges Job. His enigmatic design throws Job back into a bewildering world of wonder. In that world, Job reluctantly forgoes his demand for litigation, that demand that God would try his case. But he does recognize that he has now seen God in these things. So I feel like in Job, when we look at what does it mean to walk in wisdom, in Job, we find the answer to our suffering is not necessarily this logical explanation that we can figure out exactly why, but it's a person, right? It's the person of God who meets us, and invites us to trust him even in the midst of our confusion, even in the midst of our wrestling. Uh, and so Sarah's dad wrote in his discussion on Job, he said that message to Job is simple. Job, I alone know all about everything from beginning to end. This is as if God is speaking, including seemingly mistaken events of your birth, your life, and your present suffering. And everything is ultimately under my control. Even in regard to your present suffering, I know all about it. And I intend only good through it. I do not make mistakes. So Job shows us that we need to wrestle, that wrestling with God is honest and it's good. And I think in that, not to make an easy explanation, but in that we do find God. We do come to God when we wrestle honestly with God as Job does. As I think about Jesus in these ways, I think of his walk towards the cross. He went away in the garden and prayed and said, my Father, it is not possible. If it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. I think Jesus' honest prayer, his honest longing to knowing the sorrow and the pain and the separation and all that was going to take place. The God entering into our pain, right? We see him experiencing loneliness and suffering. Where in life, it is good to wrestle and it's good just there in those times. In our own lives, at 64, after having suffered a long time through a lot of pain, it didn't. After Sarah's pregnancy, and that didn't make sense. I think God invited us to walk with him in that grief, and and we. And so, we wrestle with things all the time that don't make sense, whether it's, cancer diagnoses, whether it's people just, dying before it just seems, before it's time. I don't know. I don't think it ever seems like it's time. And so, we mourn and we grieve, but we bring that, we bring that to God. And Job encourages us to bring that, to wrestle and meet God in those times. So again, Job, we have just wisdom. I think when we look at all the books, we have the wisdom of Proverbs that encourages us in the day-to-day walking of our lives. Where can we learn? Where can we grow? We have Ecclesiastes that I think reminds us, where might God be looking for you to find joy? Where's one aspect of your life might there be a time to rejoice in, even if some of the bigger questions go unanswered? And with Job, I think it's asking, is there sorrow in life where God is longing to meet you? Is there something that you might be asking you just to bring to him? Maybe it's something that you brought to him many times. Maybe it's an area you've been hard to just bring over to God and say, I'm just really grieving this. But where might God be inviting us to bring sorrow or pain or longing to God? And so, so just as we close, just encourage you, there's going to be a song of response, Be Thou My Vision. And so just think on those questions, take some time to reflect. I think the wisdom of the Old Testament just has a richness. It points us to Jesus in so many ways, in his teaching, in his joy, in his own walk to the cross. And so, yeah, just take some time, uh, speak with God. Where might he be encouraging you into learning, into rejoicing, into bringing some of your own questions or sorrow to him this morning?